They say home is where the heart is, but what happens when your home becomes a battlefield? When the person who should love you unconditionally becomes your most relentless opponent. My story begins not with a dramatic showdown, but with a slow, painful erosion of boundaries and respect that finally erupted on a rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 3 years since my father's death, I had managed to maintain a fragile peace with my mother, Eleanor. We'd always had a complicated relationship. She was demanding, critical, and had a gift for making even my greatest achievements feel somehow inadequate. But after Dad died from pancreatic cancer, something in her hardened. The occasional cutting remark became constant criticism. The subtle disapproval transformed into open hostility. Dad had been our buffer, our translator, the diplomat who could smooth Eleanor's sharp edges and help us find common ground. Without him, we were like two foreign nations without an interpreter, constantly misunderstanding each other and escalating minor disagreements into major conflicts. Still, I stayed. Partly out of guilt, she was alone now after all. Partly out of convenience, the 2-story colonial house in the suburbs of Portland had been my childhood home, and its mortgage was long paid off. But mostly, I stayed. Because of the promise I'd made to my father as he lay in that sterile hospital room, his one strong frame diminished by illness. "Take care of her, Nora," he'd whispered, his hand barely strong enough to squeeze mine. "She's tougher than she looks, but she'll need you." So I stayed, even as Eleanor's behavior became increasingly erratic. I stayed as she began inviting her church friends over for impromptu prayer. Circles in our living room at 6 a.m. I stayed when she reorganized my home office without permission, throwing away clutter that included important client files for my freelance graphic design business. I stayed when she started forgetting to tell me about phone calls and messages from my friends. Looking back, I should have seen the signs. The slow, methodical way she was trying to erase my presence from the house, as if by removing physical traces of me, she could somehow erase the grief that had consumed her since Dad's death. But I was too close to the situation. It's wrapped up in my own loss and the daily struggle of navigating life with a woman who seemed to resent my very existence. The beginning of the end came on a seemingly ordinary Sunday. I'd spent the weekend at my best friend Zoe's apartment, working on a major design project for a new client, a local brewery that wanted to rebrand its entire product line. It was the biggest contract I'd landed since going freelance after. Being laid off from my agency job, I needed the distraction of Zoe's company and her spacious, light-filled living room to focus. When I returned home Sunday evening, something felt off. The house was too quiet, too still. Eleanor's car was in the driveway, but there was no sound of the religious talk radio she usually kept playing at a volume that could wake the dead. No smell of the chamomile tea she drank obsessively. "Mom?" I called out, dropping my bag in the entryway. "I'm home." No answer. I moved through the house, an inexplicable sense of dread building with each empty room I passed. When I reached the second floor and turned toward my bedroom, I stopped cold. The door was open, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that my room, my sanctuary, my one private space in this increasingly hostile home had been transformed. My desk was gone. My bookshelves had been emptied. The colorful, abstract paintings I'd created during my art therapy phase after Dad's death had been removed from the walls, leaving ghostly rectangular outlines on the faded blue paint. In their place were boxes. Dozens of cardboard boxes labeled in Eleanor's precise handwriting, church donations. Goodwill, trash. My entire life categorized and packed away as if I were already gone. I stood in the doorway, unable to process what I was seeing. My lungs felt like they were filling with concrete, each breath more difficult than the last. This wasn't a spur-of-a-moment cleaning spree, but this was calculated, methodical. This had taken the entire weekend. "Mom," I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty hallway. "What did you do? Where's all my stuff?" I heard her before I saw her, the soft padding of her slippered feet on the hardwood floor behind me. You're back early, she said, her voice eerily calm.
Yes.
I thought you'd be gone until tomorrow.
Yes.
I turned to face her, this stranger wearing my mother's face. Eleanor had always been petite, but grief had whittled her down further, leaving her sharp-boned and fragile-looking. Her once dark hair was now completely silver, cut in a severe bob that emphasized the hollow angles of her face. She was wearing one of Dad's old cardigans, the sleeves rolled up multiple times to accommodate her smaller frame. What did you do? I repeated, gesturing helplessly at the boxes. Where's my desk? My paintings? My books? It's time for a change, Nora, she said, folding her arms across her chest. This house is too full of reminders. I've decided to convert this room into a prayer space. Pastor Richards says it's important for me to create new beginnings. Pastor Richards, of course, new minister at her church, who had quickly become her most trusted advisor after Dad's death. A middle-aged man with a too-wide smile who looked at the vulnerable widows in his congregation like they were walking ATMs, ready to fund his next divine mission. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You can't just decide that, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. This is my room. This is my home, too. Something flickered across Eleanor's face, a brief shadow of the mother I used to know, perhaps. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cold resolve that sent chills down my spine. No, Nora, she said quietly. This hasn't been your home for a long time. You're an adult. You should have your own place by now. I've been enabling your dependence. Pastor Richards helped me see that. The injustice of her words hit me, like a physical blow. I wasn't living here because I was dependent. I was living here because she had begged me not to leave after Dad died, because I had rearranged my entire life to fulfill a deathbed promise. Where's my stuff? I asked again, my voice breaking. My client files? My computer? The important? Things are in the garage, she said, waving dismissively. The rest? It was time to declutter. Pastor Richards is bringing some church members over tomorrow to help set up the new prayer room. I pushed past her, racing down the stairs and out to the garage. There, in a haphazard pile, were the remnants of my life that Eleanor had deemed important. My laptop, thankfully, some clothes, a few photo albums, but so much was missing. The vintage camera collection Dad and I had built together, the hand-thrown pottery set I'd bought on my solo trip to New Mexico after college, the leather-bound journals I'd kept since I was 16, gone. All of it, gone. I stormed back into the house, finding Eleanor in the kitchen calmly making her evening tea as if she hadn't just erased years of my life. How could you? I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay controlled. Those were my things, my memories. You had no right. I had every right, she replied, not looking up from her tea preparation. This is my house, decide. What stays and what goes? Dad's house too? I shot back. And he wanted me here. Eleanor's hand paused over her mug, a slight tremor visible in her fingers. Your father's not here anymore, she said, her voice tight, and it's time for both of us to move forward. You can stay in the guest room until you find your own place. I've given you a month. After 3 years of putting my life on hold to care for her, she was giving me 4 weeks to completely rearrange my existence. You can't do this, I said, hating the pleading note that had crept into my voice. Where am I supposed to go? My savings went to helping with Dad's medical bills. That's not my concern, she replied, finally turning to face me. There was something in her eyes I'd never seen before, or perhaps had never allowed myself to see. A cold detachment, as if she were looking at a stranger who had overstayed their welcome. You're resourceful. You'll figure it out. Something break inside me then, the last thread of hope that we might somehow find our way back to being mother and daughter instead of adversaries. This isn't you, I said quietly. This is Pastor Richards talking. He's changing you. Her face hardened. Pastor Richards has been a blessing. He's helped me see things clearly for the first time since your father died, including the fact that you've been taking advantage of my grief to avoid growing up. The unfairness of her accusation stole my breath. Taking advantage? I'd put my entire life on hold? I'd been her chauffeur, her housekeeper, her emotional support system. I'd fielded tearful midnight phone calls and talked her through panic attacks. I'd sacrificed job opportunities that would have required travel because she couldn't bear to be alone overnight. "You know that's not true," I said, my voice barely audible. "What I know," Eleanor said, picking up her tea and brushing past me, "is that it's time for change. For both of us." She left me standing in the kitchen, surrounded by the ghost of the family we used to be. On the refrigerator, magnets still held Christmas cards from 3 years ago, the last holiday before Dad got sick. On the wall hung the antique clock. That had been a wedding gift to my parents. Its steady ticking a reminder of how time kept moving forward, even when your heart wanted desperately to go back. That night, I slept fitfully in the sterile guest room, surrounded by the few possessions I'd managed to rescue from the garage. My mind raced with plans and worries, anger and grief taking turns keeping me awake. By morning, I'd made a decision. I wouldn't beg for more time. I wouldn't try to reason with the stranger who had replaced my mother. I would leave, on my own terms. Zoe's couch would be my temporary landing spot. She'd already texted as much when I'd filled her in on the situation. Her tiny one-bedroom apartment wasn't ideal for 2 people, but it would give me breathing room to figure out next steps. I spent the morning salvaging what I could from the garage, my heart breaking a little more with each missing treasure I couldn't locate. By noon, my car was packed with the pitiful remains of my 32 years of existence. Was to say goodbye, not to Eleanor, who had left early for a church meeting, but to the house itself. The home that had held my childhood, my adolescence, my early adulthood. I walked through each room slowly, trailing my fingers along familiar walls, saying silent farewells to the spaces that had witnessed my life unfold. In my parents' bedroom, Eleanor's bedroom now, I paused. On the nightstand was a photo I hadn't seen in years. My parents on their wedding day, young and radiant with hope. Next to it, Dad's old wooden box, where he'd kept cufflinks, his watch, and other small treasures. Without thinking, I opened it, needing some tangible connection to him. Inside were the expected items, his favorite tie clip, the pocket watch. From his grandfather, the smooth worry stone he used to keep in his pocket. But underneath them, folded neatly, was a document I didn't recognize. I pulled it out carefully, unfolding the crisp legal paper. It was a property deed for the house, updated after their last refinance about 5 years ago. My eyes scanned the document, then stopped at the names listed as owners: James Wilson, Eleanor Wilson, and Nora Wilson. My name was on the deed. I read it again, certain I was misunderstanding. But there it was, in black and white legal language. Dad had added me as a co-owner when they'd refinanced. The house wasn't just Eleanor's, it was mine too. Yes, the realization hit me like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just my childhood home, it was legally, partially mine. Lana couldn't simply declare that I needed to leave. She couldn't unilaterally decide to give away my possessions or convert my bedroom into a prayer space for her increasingly cultish church group. I stood there, the document trembling in my hands. It's a lifetime of accommodating Eleanor's demands, of walking on eggshells to avoid her disapproval, of sacrificing my own needs to keep the peace, crystallized into a single clarifying thought. No more. No more allowing her to dictate the terms of my existence. No more accepting her version of reality as the only valid one. No more diminishing myself to avoid conflict. I carefully folded the deed and slipped it into my pocket. Then I walked out of the bedroom, down the stairs, and out the front door, without looking back. My first stop wasn't Zoe's apartment as planned. Instead, I drove straight to Martin Peterson's office. Martin had been Dad's attorney and friend for over 20 years. If anyone could help me understand what this deed meant for my rights, it would be him. Martin's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, its interior a warm contrast of modern furnishings against restored historical details. His assistant, a kind-faced woman who'd known me since I was a teenager, immediately ushered me in when she saw my tear-streaked face. "Nora," Martin said, rising from behind his desk to greet me. He'd aged since I'd last seen him at Dad's funeral. His hair was completely white now, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. But his handshake was still firm, his gaze direct and compassionate. "This is an unexpected pleasure. What brings you here today?" I pulled out the deed with shaking hands and placed it on his desk. "I found this in Dad's things," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I need to know what it means. Legally." Martin picked up the document, his expression shifting from friendly to professional as he scanned it. He reached for his reading glasses, studied the deed more carefully, then looked up at me. "It means exactly what you think it means," he said. "Your father added you as a joint tenant with right of survivorship when they refinanced the house. You own 1/3 of the property, so she can't kick me out?" I asked, hardly daring to believe it. "She can't just decide it's her house and I have to leave." Martin leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach in a gesture so reminiscent of Dad that my throat tightened. "No, she absolutely cannot. As a co-owner, you have equal right to occupy the property. She would need your consent to sell it or make major changes to its use." "Like converting my bedroom into a church prayer room?" I asked. Martin's eyebrows rose. "That sounds like there's a story here I'm not aware of." So I told him everything. The gradual deterioration of my relationship with Eleanor after Dad's death, her increasing involvement with Pastor Richards and his church, the way she'd systematically been trying to erase my presence from the house, and finally, the ultimatum and the discovery of my missing possessions. I spoke. Martin's expression grew increasingly concerned. When I finished, he removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, another gesture so like Dad's that it was almost painful to watch. "Nora," he said finally, "I'm sorry you're going through this. What you're describing, it's concerning on multiple levels. It's Pastor Richards. His influence over your mother doesn't sound healthy." "It's not," I agreed. "But what can I do about it? She's an adult. She can choose her own religious path, even if it's extreme." "True," Martin conceded. "But what she can't do is dispose of your property without your consent or evict you from a home you legally owned." He tapped the deed thoughtfully. "You have options here. Legal options." "Like what?" "Well, for starters, you could file for a temporary restraining order to prevent her from removing any more of your possessions or making further changes to the house without your consent. You could also potentially file a civil suit for the value of the items she's already disposed of." The thought of taking legal action against my own mother made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to consider it objectively. This wasn't about punishing Eleanor. It was about protecting myself and establishing boundaries that should have been in place long ago. What if I wanted her to leave?" I asked, the words feeling foreign and wrong even as I spoke them. "Could I evict her?" Martin's expression grew solemn. "It's complicated. Neither of you can unilaterally evict the other from a jointly owned property. However, you could file for a partition action, essentially asking the court to either physically divide the property or, more likely in this case, force its sale and split the proceeds." A partition action. It sounded so cold, so final. The nuclear option. "I don't want to sell the house," I said quietly. "It's my home. It's where Dad is, where his memory lives." Martin nodded, understanding in his eyes. "There's another option, though it would require careful handling. You could serve her with a notice to vacate, claiming exclusive occupancy based on her actions. It wouldn't have legal force without a court order, but it might be enough to shock her into realizing the seriousness of the situation. A notice to vacate, an eviction notice for my own mother. The idea was simultaneously horrifying and oddly satisfying. After years of accommodating her increasingly unreasonable demands, of sacrificing my own needs and wants, of being made to feel like an unwelcome guest in my own home, the thought of turning the tables had a certain poetic justice to it. "Would you help me draft it?" I asked, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. Martin studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once, decisively. "I'll help you, Nora. But I want you to be very clear about what you're doing here. This isn't just a legal maneuver. This is a statement to your mother and to yourself about boundaries and respect. Once you cross this line, your relationship may never be the same." "Our relationship hasn't been the same since Dad died," I said, a lump forming in my throat. Maybe it was never what I thought it was to begin with. Martin sighed heavily, then reached for a legal pad. All right, let's draft this notice. Promise me you'll take some time to think before you actually serve it. Make sure this is really the path you want to take. I promised, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew my decision was already made. For too long, I'd allowed Eleanor to define our relationship, to set the terms of our interaction. It was time for that to change. 2 hours later, I left Martin's office with a professionally drafted notice to vacate in my hand and await, both heavier and lighter on my shoulders. Heavier with the knowledge of what I was about to do, lighter with the certainty that I was finally standing up for myself. Instead of heading to Zoe's as planned, I drove back to the house, my house, I reminded myself firmly. Eleanor's car was in the driveway, which meant she was back from her church meeting. Good. This needed to be done face to face. I parked on the street and sat for a moment, gathering my courage. Through the front window, I could see movement. Eleanor in the living room, rearranging furniture. Preparing for tomorrow's prayer room setup, no doubt. My phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. All set up the couch for you. Let me know when you're heading over, I texted back. Change of plans. Found out I'd coned the house. Confronting Mom now. Zoe's reply was immediate. Oh my God. Want me to come for backup? I considered it briefly, then declined. This was between Eleanor and me. It always had been. Taking a deep breath, I got out of the car and walked up the familiar path to the front door. I still had my key, but something stopped me from using it. Instead, I rang the doorbell like a visitor, the notice to vacate clutched in my hand. When Eleanor opened the door, she looked momentarily startled to see me. Nora, I thought you'd left. We need to talk, I said, pushing past her into the entryway. The living room had indeed been rearranged. The comfortable old sofa where Dad used to read the Sunday paper was gone, replaced by rows of folding chairs facing a makeshift altar. Eleanor followed me, her arms crossed defensively. There's nothing to talk about. I told you, you have a month to find your own place. Actually, I said, turning to face her, that's not how this works. I found something interesting today when I was saying goodbye to the house. Her expression flickered confusion, then a dawning realization, then something close to fear. What are you talking about? The deed, Mom, I said quietly. Put my name on it when you refinanced 5 years ago. I'm a co-owner of this house. You can't kick me out. Can't give away my things. Can't make unilateral decisions about this property. Eleanor's face went pale, then flushed with anger. That's not possible. James wouldn't have done that without telling me. But he did, I replied, keeping my voice calm, despite the storm of emotions inside me. Maybe he wanted to make sure I always had a home. Maybe he was worried about exactly this kind of situation. Let me see it, she demanded, holding out. Her hand, I shook my head. I've left it in a safe place. But I've shown it to Martin Peterson, and he's confirmed its validity. At the mention of Dad's lawyer, something shifted in Eleanor's expression, the certainty giving way to doubt. Martin, you went to Martin with this? I did. He helped me prepare this. I held out the notice to vacate, watching as her eyes widened in disbelief. What is that? She asked, not reaching to take it. It's a notice to vacate the premises, I said, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. It states that, due to your actions, disposing of my personal property without consent, attempting to convert spaces in our jointly owned home without agreement, and creating a hostile living environment, I am exercising my right as a co-owner to claim exclusive occupancy. Eleanor stared at the paper as if it might burst into flames. You're evicting me from my own home? Our home, I corrected gently, and yes, I am. Unless we can come to an agreement about how to coexist here with mutual respect and boundaries. Her hand flew to her throat, fingers clutching at the gold cross she'd taken to wearing since becoming involved with Pastor Richard's church. You can't do this. This is cruel. This is not what your father would have wanted. Dad wanted us to take care of each other, I said, feeling tears begin to well in my eyes. But that's not what's been happening here, is it? You've been systematically trying to erase me from this house, from your life, ever since he died. I've been letting you, because I thought that's what he would have wanted. But I don't think it is. Eleanor's face crumpled, the mask of cold authority falling away to reveal the broken, grieving woman beneath. You don't understand, she whispered. Pastor Richard says I need to let go of the past to move forward. That includes attachments that keep me tethered to grief. Attachments? I repeated incredulously. I'm your daughter, not an attachment. And Pastor Richards doesn't get to decide how we process our grief. Eleanor sank onto one of the folding chairs, suddenly looking every one of her 65 years. He says your presence here is a constant reminder of what I've lost. That as long as you're here, I'll never truly heal. The cruel manipulation behind those words made my blood boil. And you believed him? You believed that cutting out your only child would somehow make you feel better? She looked up at me, her eyes swimming with tears. I don't know what to believe anymore, Nora. I just know that it hurts. Every day it hurts so much. And Pastor Richards promised me it would stop hurting if I followed his guidance. In that moment, I saw Eleanor clearly for perhaps the first time in my adult life, not as the formidable, critical mother who had loomed so large in my psyche, but as a broken, vulnerable woman, desperate for relief from her pain. A woman who had been expertly manipulated by someone who recognized her vulnerability and exploited it. I sat down beside her, the eviction notice still in my hand, but suddenly feeling less urgent. Mom, I said gently, grief doesn't work that way. You can't just cut out pieces of your life and expect the pain to stop. Dad is gone, but I'm still here. I'm still your family. How'd you look so much like him? She whispered, her voice breaking. Sometimes I look at you and it's like seeing a ghost. It's like losing him all over again. The admission struck me like a physical blow. All this time I'd thought her coldness was about me, about some fundamental flaw in me that made me unlovable to her. But it had never been about me at all. It had been about her pain, her inability to separate me from the loss of Dad. I know I do, I said softly. But that's a gift, isn't it? A part of him lives on in me. In us, together. Eleanor covered her face with her hands, her shoulders, shaking with silent sobs. I hesitated, then placed my hand gently on her back, the first time I'd touched her in months. She stiffened initially, then gradually relaxed under my touch. We sat like that for a long time, the eviction notice forgotten on my lap, the rows of folding chairs surrounding us like silent witnesses to this fragile moment of connection. Finally, Eleanor straightened, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, a gesture so uncharacteristically vulnerable that it made my heart ache. What happens now? She asked, her voice small but steadier. I looked down at the notice, then deliberately folded it and put it back in my pocket. That depends on you, Mom. I don't want to evict you. I don't want to take you to court. I want us to find a way to live together that respects both of our needs and boundaries. Is that even possible? She asked, genuine uncertainty in her voice, after everything that's happened. I don't know, I answered honestly, but I think it's worth trying, for Dad's sake if nothing else. Eleanor nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the makeshift altar she'd been setting up. Pastor Richards won't be happy, she murmured, almost to herself. With all due respect, I said, unable to keep a hint of steel from my voice. Pastor Richards doesn't get a vote in how we run our home. A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. The first genuine smile I'd seen from her in longer than I could remember. No, she agreed quietly. I suppose he doesn't. That conversation was the beginning not of a miraculous healing or an instant restoration of our relationship, but of a slow, painful, necessary renegotiation of boundaries. The next day, when Pastor Richards and his church members arrived to set up the prayer room, they found Eleanor and me presenting a united front at the door, politely but firmly turning them away. Pastor Richards didn't take it well, his mask. A benevolent spiritual guidance slipped, revealing the manipulative opportunist beneath. He threatened Eleanor with spiritual consequences, tried to guilt her with talk of abandoning her path to healing, even implied that her salvation might be at risk. But with me by her side, Eleanor found the strength to stand firm. My daughter and I need time to heal together, she told him, her voice trembling but determined. God will understand that. After they left, Eleanor sat heavily on the couch, looking shell-shocked. He wasn't who I thought he was he? She asked softly. No, I replied gently. I don't think he was. The weeks that followed were challenging in different ways. We began the painstaking process of retrieving what we could of my belongings. Tracking down the church members who had been given my things, visiting local donation centers with photos and descriptions. Some items were gone forever, a loss I had to grieve all over again. But others came back to us, each recovered treasure, a small victory. More difficult was the emotional work of rebuilding trust between us. We started seeing a family therapist, Dr. Hayes, kind but no-nonsense woman who helped us navigate the complicated terrain of our grief, our resentments, and our hopes for a new kind of relationship. You're both mourning, James, she told us in one particularly breakthrough session. But you're also mourning the relationship you had with each other when he was alive. That relationship can't exist anymore. You need to build something new. Building something new meant uncomfortable conversations. It meant Eleanor acknowledging the hurt she'd caused me and taking responsibility for her actions, even those influenced by Pastor Richards. It meant me recognizing the depth of her grief and the ways I'd sometimes used Dad's memory as a weapon against her. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. There were setbacks, days when Eleanor would retreat into cold silence, days when I would snap at her with accumulated resentment. But there were also moments of unexpected connection. The afternoon we spent sorting through Dad's clothes together, crying and laughing over memories attached to favorite sweaters and worn-out shoes. The evening Eleanor asked to see my portfolio and really looked at my design work for the first time, offering genuine admiration for my talent. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, we began to forge a new kind of relationship, not the idealized mother-daughter bond I'd always longed for, but something real and honest, built on a foundation of hard-won mutual respect. 6 months after the day I discovered my name on the deed, Eleanor and I stood together in what had once been my childhood bedroom. The space had been transformed again, not into Pastor Richard's prayer room, but into a proper home office for my growing design business. Eleanor had helped me paint the walls a soft sage green, had assisted in assembling the new desk we'd picked out together. "It looks good," she said, standing in the doorway and surveying our work. "Your father would approve." "He would," I agreed, adjusting the position of my computer monitor, though he'd probably have insisted on doing all the furniture assembly himself, even though the instructions clearly called for 2 people. Eleanor smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. He was stubborn that way. "Wonder where I get it from," I replied, returning her smile. She laughed softly, then grew serious. "Nora, I found something yesterday when I was cleaning out the attic. I think you should have it." She handed me a small, worn leather journal I recognized immediately. Dad's. He'd carried it everywhere, jotting down ideas, sketching little doodles, making notes about things he wanted to remember. "I haven't looked inside," Eleanor said. "It felt too private somehow, but I think he'd want you to have it." I took the journal, running my fingers over the soft, cracked leather. "Thank you," I whispered, my throat tight with emotion. Eleanor nodded, then hesitated in the doorway. "I'm going to make some tea. Would you like some?" It was a small gesture, an ordinary moment of consideration, but in the context of our journey, it felt monumental. "I'd love some," I replied. "I'll be down in a minute." After she left, I sat at my new desk and carefully opened Dad's journal. Inside, on the first page, written in his familiar handwriting, was a quote, "Home is not a place, it's a feeling." Below it, he'd added his own words. "For Nora, remember that wherever you go, whatever you do, you carry home within you. But also remember that this house will always be yours too. I've made sure of it, love, Dad." Tears blurred my vision as I realized the truth. Dad hadn't just put my name on the deed as a practical matter of inheritance. He'd done it as a message to me, a promise that I would always have a place to belong, even after he was gone. He couldn't have foreseen exactly how that gift would play out. But somehow in his quiet wisdom, he provided exactly what I would need when the time came. I closed the journal and wiped my eyes, then went downstairs to join my mother for tea. As I entered the kitchen, I saw her at the counter, carefully preparing the mugs the way we each preferred hers, with honey, mine with a splash of milk. Such a simple act, but one that spoke volumes about the distance we'd traveled and the new understanding we were building day by day. Home isn't just a place, Dad had written. It's a feeling, looking at Eleanor, really seeing her as she was. Now, not as the perfect mother I'd longed for, or the villain. I'd cast her as in my darkest moments. I felt something settle inside me. We weren't perfect.
Ow.
Our relationship would never be without its challenges. But we were finding our way back to that feeling of home together. I thought we could start looking for your things, she said without preamble, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. I made some calls this morning. The church donation drive doesn't happen until next week, so nothing's been distributed yet. Pastor Richards wasn't happy, but Sister Margaret promised she'd set aside anything she recognizes as yours. Down slowly, wrapping my hands around the warm mug she'd prepared for me, with just the right amount of cream, I noticed. A small thing, but significant from a woman who had spent years pretending not to notice my preferences. Thank you, I said, my voice still rough with sleep. That's a good start. Eleanor nodded, not meeting my eyes. In the harsh morning light, she looked exhausted, the lines around her mouth and eyes deeper than I'd noticed before. She'd clearly slept as poorly as I had. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, she continued, her fingers nervously smoothing the newspaper's edge. About Dad wanting us to take care of each other. I don't think I've been doing that. Not really. The admission hung in the air between us, fragile and unprecedented. Eleanor wasn't a woman who acknowledged mistakes easily. Her apologies, on the rare occasions they came, were usually oblique changes in behavior rather than explicit words of remorse. I haven't been perfect either, I offered, a small olive branch. I've been so focused on what I lost when Dad died that I haven't really seen what you lost. Eleanor's eyes flickered up to meet mine, a flash of surprise in them. He was my partner for 37 years, she said quietly. When he died, I didn't just lose my husband, it lost my future. All those plans we made for retirement, for traveling, for growing old together, they disappeared overnight. I never thought of it that way before. My grief, I'd been selfish, viewing Dad's death primarily through the lens of my own loss. I hadn't fully considered what it meant for Eleanor to have the entire trajectory of her expected life vanish in an instant. That must have been terrifying, I said. It was, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It still is. That's why Pastor Richard's certainty was so comforting. He had answers when everything felt like questions. Understanding bloomed in me then, not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. Eleanor's increasing rigidity, her desperate clinging to the church group, even her attempts to erase my presence from the house, they weren't just acts of cruelty. They were the flailing attempts of a drowning woman to find something solid to hold on to in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly unpredictable. We need to figure out a new way forward, I said, both of us, together. Eleanor nodded, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. I'd like that. That morning marked the beginning of a strange, tentative dance between us. Neither fully trusting, neither completely open, but both cautiously willing to try. We started with the practical, creating a list of my missing possessions and methodically tracking them down. Some items had already been picked up by church members. Others were boxed in the garage or the basement. A few precious things, my collection of first edition fantasy novels, my grandmother's pearl earrings, had been set aside by Eleanor herself, hidden in her closet in a moment of subconscious hesitation, as if some part of her had been unwilling to completely sever my connection to the house. Each recovered treasure was a small victory, a tangible sign that restoration was possible. But the real work, the emotional work, was harder and messier. It began unexpectedly one evening. As we sorted through a box of my childhood memorabilia that had been slated for donation, I remember this, Eleanor said, holding up a crude clay sculpture I'd made in elementary school. It was meant to be a cat, but looked more like a lumpy alien creature with too many legs. You were so proud of it, you insisted on putting it on the dining room table for Thanksgiving dinner that year. Dad called it our conversation piece, I recalled, smiling at the memory. He made up that elaborate story about how it was a priceless artifact from an ancient civilization. And your Uncle Robert believed him, Eleanor added, a chuckle escaping her. Kept asking what museum we'd borrowed it from. We both laughed. This sounds strange and welcome in a house that had known little joy for 3 years. But as the laughter faded, I saw Eleanor's expression change, her eyes growing distant. We were happy then, weren't we? She asked softly. The three of us? The question caught me off guard. Of course we were, I replied. We were a family. Eleanor set the sculpture down carefully, her movements deliberate. I wasn't always easy to live with, she said, choosing her words with obvious care. Even then, I know that. It was. Such a massive understatement that I nearly laughed again. Eleanor had always been demanding, particular, quick to criticize and slow to praise. But before Dad's death, her sharp edges had been balanced by his warmth. Her high expectations tempered by his easy acceptance. You pushed me to be better, I said diplomatically. You had high standards. I was too hard on you, she corrected, meeting my gaze directly. I thought I was preparing you for a world that wouldn't be kind. But James always said I was making you afraid to fail, instead of eager to try. I stared at her, stunned by this sudden introspection. Eleanor had never, in my entire life, acknowledged that her parenting style might have been damaging. He was right, I said quietly. I spent most of my childhood terrified of disappointing you. Pain flashed across her face, but she didn't deny it. I didn't know how to be different, she said. My own mother was. Well, she made me look permissive by comparison. I thought I was doing better than she had. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I'd never known my maternal grandmother well. She'd died when I was young, but the few memories I had were of a stern, cold woman who seemed incapable of showing affection. Eleanor, for all her flaws, had at least occasionally managed hugs and words of pride, even if they were rationed like precious resources. You were, I assured her. And Dad helped balance things out. He did, she agreed, a deep sadness shadowing her eyes. Without him, I think I reverted to what I knew. Control. Rigidity. It felt safer somehow. We continued sorting through the box in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I found myself wondering how different our relationship might have been if Eleanor had been able to have this kind of insight years ago, if she'd been able to see how her own upbringing had shaped her parenting, how her fear of a harsh world had led her to create a harsh home. But there was no changing the past. We could only move forward from where we were now. The next few weeks brought a series of small, significant changes to our household. Eleanor canceled the standing prayer meetings that had taken over our living room. I moved back into my bedroom, gradually reclaiming the space as my own. We established tentative boundaries, knocking before entering each other's rooms, discussing major purchases or changes to shared spaces, respecting each other's need for privacy and solitude. But the most significant change came from an unexpected quarter. One evening, as I was working on designs for my brewery client at the kitchen table, Eleanor hesitantly approached me. I've been thinking, she said, hovering uncertainly near my chair, about what you said about us taking care of each other. I looked up from my laptop, giving her my full attention. Yes, I haven't been fair to you since your father died, she said, the words clearly difficult for her. You put your life on hold to stay here with me. You've been carrying more than your share of everything. The bills, the house maintenance, the emotional burden. I opened my mouth to protest out of habit, then closed it again. She wasn't wrong. Since Dad's death, I'd taken over most of the household finances. All of the yard work and home repairs and the lion's share of the emotional labor in our relationship. I want to fix that, Eleanor continued when I didn't speak. I've made an appointment with Martin tomorrow. I want to update my will and make some changes to our financial arrangements. Alarm bells rang in my head. After everything we'd been through, was she planning to try to remove me from the deed somehow? To cut me out financially? Eleanor must have read the suspicion on my face, because she hurried to clarify. No, nothing like that. I just want to make sure that you're properly protected, that your contribution to this household is recognized. And she hesitated, then squared her shoulders. I want to help you with your business, financially. I blinked at her, certain I'd misheard. My business, your graphic design work, she said, gesturing to my laptop screen. James always believed. In your talent, he would have wanted to invest in it, so I want to. Well, I want to invest in you, help you set up a proper studio, maybe hire an assistant, so you can take on more clients. I stared at her, speechless. This was the last thing I'd expected. Eleanor had always viewed my creative pursuits with thinly veiled skepticism, treating my design career as a hobby rather than a legitimate profession. Why? I managed finally. Eleanor sat down across from me, her face solemn. Because it's what partners do, she said simply. They support each other. We are partners in this house. In this life we're rebuilding. Aren't we partners? Not mother and dependent daughter, not reluctant housemates. Partners. The word shifted something. Fundamental in our dynamic, suggesting an equality we'd never before acknowledged. Yes, I said, my voice thick with unexpected emotion. I guess we are. The meeting with Martin the next day formalized this new partnership in ways that still leave me amazed when I think about them. Eleanor not only updated her will to ensure the house would fully pass to me upon her death, but she also established a business investment fund, using money from her retirement savings to help me expand my graphic design business. Most surprisingly, she suggested we convert the rarely used formal dining room into a proper home studio for me, complete with professional-grade equipment and space for meeting with clients. Are you sure about this? Martin asked her, clearly. As surprised as I was by this sudden generosity, this is a significant financial commitment. Eleanor looked at me, something I'd never seen before, shining in her eyes, not just love, though that was there, but respect, recognition of me. As an adult with dreams and talents worth nurturing, I'm sure, she said firmly. It's time I started investing in our future instead of clinging to the past. That evening, as we drove home from Martin's office, a comfortable silence filled the car. The legal documents we'd signed felt like more than just financial arrangements. They were tangible symbols of a new covenant between us, a promise to move forward together with mutual respect and support. I keep thinking about what Dad would say if he could see us now, I said as we pulled into the driveway. After everything that's happened, Eleanor turned off the engine, but made no move to get out of the car. He'd be relieved, she said, after a moment's reflection, and probably a little smug. He always said we were more alike than either of us wanted to admit. I laughed, surprised by how true that felt. Strong-willed, I acknowledged. Stubborn as mules, Eleanor corrected, with a small smile, but also resilient. That's what James always said. It's two resilient women. Resilient was a good word for what we were discovering in ourselves and in each other. Not unbreakable, we had both very much broken in the aftermath of Dad's death, but capable of being reassembled, of growing stronger at the mended places. The transformation of the dining room into my studio became our first true collaborative project. We spent evenings poring over design magazines and furniture catalogs, weekends painting walls and assembling shelving units. Eleanor, I discovered, had an unexpected eye for color and a surprising willingness to get her hands dirty. I found myself enjoying her company in a way I never had before, not as a daughter seeking approval, but as an equal engaged in a shared creative endeavor. What do you think of this for the accent wall? She asked one Saturday morning, holding up a paint sample in a rich teal blue. Too bold, considered it, trying to envision the color against the neutral gray we'd chosen for the other walls. I like bold, I decided. Dad would have approved. He would have, she agreed, a tender smile softening her face. He always said our house had too many beige walls. We painted the accent wall that afternoon, working side by side and comfortable. Silence punctuated by occasional conversation. As I watched Eleanor carefully cutting in along the ceiling, her silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, a paint smudge on her cheek, I realized I was seeing a side of her I'd never been allowed to see before. Playful, creative, willing to embrace imperfection in pursuit of something beautiful. "You're different," I observed, during a water break, the words escaping before I could consider their impact. Eleanor paused, water glass halfway to her lips. "Different how?" I gestured vaguely, struggling to articulate the subtle but profound shift I'd noticed. More present, more yourself somehow. She considered this, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "I feel different," she admitted. "For years, even before your father died, I was so focused on maintaining appearances. The perfect house, the perfect family, the perfect life. I was exhausted all the time, but I didn't know how to stop. After he died, it got worse. Every little imperfection felt like the world might end if I acknowledged it." "I know," I prompted gently. "Now," she said slowly, "I'm starting to think that perfect was never the point. That maybe good enough, messy, real, honest is actually better." It was such a fundamental reframing of Eleanor's entire worldview that I felt momentarily dizzy with the implications. All my life, I'd been measured against an impossible standard of perfection. To hear her renounce it so simply, so completely, was both liberating and disorienting.
Wow.
"That's what Dad always said," I murmured, "that the most beautiful things are imperfect." "He was wiser than I gave him credit for," Eleanor said, with a soft, sad laugh, "about so many things." We resumed painting, but something had shifted again between us. Another layer of pretense stripped away, another step toward authentic connection. The studio was completed by early spring, a bright, functional space that perfectly balanced aesthetics and practicality. Business, bolstered by Eleanor's investment, began to flourish. I hired a part-time assistant, expanded my client base beyond local businesses to include several national brands, and even won a regional design award for my brewery rebrand campaign. Eleanor, meanwhile, underwent her own transformation. Gradually distanced herself from Pastor Richard's church, finding instead a smaller, more progressive congregation led by a thoughtful female minister who emphasized community service over rigid doctrine. She volunteered at the local library, joined a book club, and even started taking painting classes at the community center, something she'd always wanted to try but had dismissed. As frivolous during her decades of practical self-denial, we weren't without our difficult moments. Old patterns don't disappear overnight, and we both had decades of ingrained responses to overcome. Eleanor still occasionally slipped into criticism. When stressed, still sometimes retreated into defensive silence rather than confronting issues directly. But the difference was that now we recognized these patterns when they emerged and had developed tools to address them before they could derail our progress. One particularly significant breakthrough came about 6 months after our confrontation. I'd been dating someone, Michael, a kind, thoughtful architect I'd met through a client, and had been hesitant to introduce him to Eleanor. My previous relationships had always withered under her critical gaze. No one was ever quite good enough in her estimation. "I'd like to have Michael over for dinner," I said one evening, bracing myself for the familiar disapproval. Eleanor looked up from her book, surprise evident on her face. "Of course," she said, "that would be lovely. What night works for you both?" I stared at her, waiting for the catch, the subtle dig, the list of expectations and warnings. None came. "You don't want to interrogate me about him first?" I asked suspiciously. "No questions about his family or his career prospects or whether he goes to church?" A flash of hurt crossed Eleanor's face, quickly replaced by understanding. "I've earned that distrust," she acknowledged. "But no, I don't need to interrogate you. You're an adult with good judgment. If you care about this man, I'm sure he's worth knowing." The simple vote of confidence left me momentarily speechless. All my life, I'd craved this kind of trust. From Eleanor, this recognition of my ability to make my own choices. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. "Don't thank me for basic respect," Eleanor replied quietly. "I should have given it to you long ago." The dinner, when it happened, was a revelation. Eleanor was warm, engaging, genuinely interested in getting to know Michael without subjecting him to the third degree I'd feared. She shared funny stories from my childhood that somehow managed to be endearing rather than embarrassing. She asked thoughtful questions about his work and actually listened to his answers. When he complimented her cooking, She accepted the praise graciously instead of dismissing it with her usual self-deprecation. After Michael left, promising to call me the next day, I found Eleanor in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher. That went well, I said, still slightly disbelieving. He seems wonderful, she replied, rinsing a wine glass. Intelligent, clearly crazy about you. Your father would have liked him. The casual mention of Dad's approval, something she'd never before volunteered about anyone. I dated brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I think so too, I managed. Eleanor turned from the sink, drying her hands on a dish towel. She studied my face for a moment, then said softly, I'm sorry I made this hard for you before. Bringing people home. Sharing your life. I was. A being left behind, she admitted, the words clearly difficult for her. First by you, then by your father. I thought if I set the bar impossibly high, no one would ever meet it and you'd stay close, safe mine. She shook her head, a rueful smile on her lips. It was selfish and short-sighted, and it nearly cost me my relationship with you. The honesty of her self-assessment took my breath away. This new Eleanor, reflective, self-aware, willing to acknowledge her mistakes, was someone I was still getting to know. Obligation, I said, moving to help her with the dishes. I'm not going anywhere now. Neither of us is. We're partners, remember? She smiled, handing me a plate to dry. Partners, she agreed. In this imperfect, beautiful life we're building, spring turned to summer, our newly redefined relationship continued to strengthen and evolve. The house that had once felt like a battleground became a true home again, not the same as it had been when Dad was alive, something new and equally valid. A place where two strong-willed women had learned to coexist with respect, and even joy, where memories of the past could live alongside hopes for the future. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching fireflies blink in the gathering dusk, Eleanor broke a comfortable silence with a question that caught me off guard. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? She asked, her voice soft but steady. Truly forgive me, I mean, for everything that happened? I considered the question carefully, wanting to give her the honesty she deserved. I think forgiveness isn't a single moment, I said finally. It's a process. Every day, every positive interaction, every time we choose understanding over resentment, that's forgiveness in action. Eleanor nodded, absorbing this. That's very wise, she said. Your father's influence, I think. Yours too, I replied, surprising myself with the realization. You taught me perseverance, to keep working at something difficult until it's right. She laughed softly, the sound carrying in the quiet evening air. I never thought my stubbornness would be counted as a virtue. It is when it's applied to the right things, I said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. Like rebuilding a relationship that matters. Eleanor returned the pressure of my fingers, her palm warm against mine. We sat there as darkness fell completely. Two imperfect women, who had nearly lost everything, but had found the courage to begin again. Not as mother and daughter in the traditional sense, but as something perhaps more valuable, partners in the shared enterprise of creating a life worth living, a home worth coming back to. Thank you, Eleanor said, as we finally rose to go inside, for not giving up on me. For finding that deed and having the courage to use it. Thank you, I replied, for being brave enough to change. The eviction notice that had once symbolized the ultimate rupture between us now lived in my desk drawer, a reminder not of what we'd almost lost, but of how far we'd come. A testament to the fact that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to set a boundary, to say no more, to demand the respect you deserve. That folded piece of paper had changed everything, not because of its legal power, but because it had forced both of us to confront the truth we'd been avoiding for 3 years, that grief doesn't have to destroy love, that conflict doesn't have to end connection, that sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones that save us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.